Thank you, Vidya. Let me first start by thanking the organizers by putting this amazing school together. I was in San Sebastian before, but every time I come, it's like, wow. And yeah, thanks to all of you for coming to this hands-on session. So I titled my talk Engineer Topological Matter and Machine Learning for Quantum Application because I was trying to wedge the topic within so it would the school would fit a bit more with the topics I'm working on. Maybe before we start, just so I know who I am talking to, hands up who had a quantum information or quantum computing class. So that's not everyone. Maybe hands up who knows what a superconducting qubit is. That's better. Okay. and and then who have ever programmed anything in Python? And who has some machine learning experience already? So even we have a handful of those. Okay, perfect. But nothing to worry about. I will make everything very introductory, and I hope you can follow with me. So this school is kind of centered at the different interesting overlaps of these three emergent fields that kind of sort of developed separately in the last few years, but now they are merging interestingly. So the first overlap is this one, right? That's a lot of talks that you are hearing at this school where you use somehow the topological excitations for quantum computing purposes, at least in theory. I myself am moving more in the quantum computing and machine learning space. So there is a lot of interesting overlaps here where you can use just machine learning as a new kind of computational technique to, for example, model quantum circuits. And a lot of stuff that we are doing in my group is to work on a software that can automatically tune and control quantum devices. Okay, and then we come to the overlap of Donut and the machine learning, where there is some really interesting research going on, where you can sort of classify phases of matter or even discover new physics from data at the overlap that we say experimentalists measure a lot of interesting stuff. So we can either fit that to our underlying toy models, or we can build an algorithm that will look at the data and search if there is some interesting features or anomaly in the data. And then I hope to make this lecture sort of in the middle of the intersection of this tree. So we will divide this into the three parts. So my main job here is to show you machine learning in the context of topological quantum computing. But before I do that, I want to also, everyone else gets to show off what their group is working on. So I am first going to show you some real quick pitch on about a fun overlap of topological matter and quantum computing that we did in my group. Then we are gonna take a break. Then we are gonna do a machine learning primer. So really everyone is on the same page about what neural networks do specifically. And after that, I prepared for you a couple of exercise notebooks that based on your level of expertise you can try to solve. We have something even for a complete beginners, so don't be scared of the coding portion. Okay, so let me start with this first part, just introducing a little bit of the topological materials with superconducting circuits, which is something we were looking at in my group lately. So I want to entice you by a fun conceptual idea, and that's the following. You keep hearing a lot at this school about these really fundamental properties of topological matter and about different excitations that you can discover if you are Charlie and his amazing team and you all do these experiments properly. So there is another way of looking at it, at least I believe there is, that you can think maybe I can build those models in a very scalable way from like a Lego building blocks with some simpler system and see if I can sort of engineer those same topological excitation in a much more controlled conditions where maybe I don't have to deal with all of these complex material effects. So yeah, this is just a brief thing. You have topology and condensed matter. Looking at the poster session yesterday, you are all amazing experts in this field already, and you have all the lectures here explaining you everything from topological insulators to topological superconductivity. There is another field that developed as a sort of a basis based from this topology in condensed matter, and that's a field of classical materials, which is super interesting. It started around 2015, and basically what it is that we sort of learned about topology by looking at these fundamentally quantum things, right? You look at some Hamiltonian, you solve it, you get some excitation, and then suddenly you realize that like you can braid it, and it's amazing. But there is a lot of topology which is purely not quantum. And this is what this field is about. If you just take a non-interactive model, nothing is stopping you from hanging pendula correctly from the ceiling and couple them with the springs and have some topological edge modes. Or there is a lot of progress with just doing it really with the electrical circuits where you just put, like, electrical components on the chip. My favorite example of this is from my former group of Sebastian Huber at ETH Zurich. This is a pendula that we had hanging from the ceiling in the lab. And they are coupled in a fun way that you get like a spin-hole-like edge mode if you push it. Basically, the bulk doesn't, you push the pendula, and the bulk doesn't move. And based on which sublattice you excite, the mode is either going to go left or to the right. And you have topologically protected mode just with the pendula, right? So this is super much fun, but then the idea is like, I can play with pendula, but then can it be useful for something, right? So then I like to think about, still by doing this, you can isolate some really basic design principles on how to create those metamaterials that have a topological properties in an engineered way. So what I am interested in is to bring it back to the quantum domain and see if we can do some interesting quantum things with that. So I'm going to explain all of this on a simple topological example that is a Sushrifer-Hager model. I heard that Charlie already covered it a bit in his lecture. This is the first example that you will have in any topological textbook. I am not going to go through deriving the winding number. I'm just going to tell you what the topology is, and you just trust me, and then we go with it. So this was developed for non-interacting electrons hopping on a staggered lattice. So you have lattice where your hoppings, V and W, are different. So you have a different hopping inside of the unit cell and different hopping between unit cells. And then this model has two interesting limits. In one, I'm going to put W to 0, and then nothing much interesting happens because I just decoupled the unit cells from each other. But in the other one, if I put the V to 0 and I only keep the W coupling, you are gonna get these isolated edges, and now you heard about Majorana all day, so you already know where this is going. In the case of this topological of this SSH model, what happens that suddenly two states appears in the middle of the gap, and they are exponentially located at the boundaries. This plot is a wave function amplitude, and this is the lattice index, and we do 1A, 1B, so we have a different index for each color. So you have a one mode that is a symmetric superposition of these edges, and then you have one mode that is antisymmetric superposition of these edges. And then with this model, now I'm gonna show a bit of this. Then that's unrelated to machine learning introduction. And then we are going to take this model and use a simple neural network to classify these topological and trivial phases. But maybe you say this is simple because I know which the topological one is, so don't worry, I am going to make it harder for you. Okay, so this is really in the core of what we are going to discuss. Just a single particle hopping on a staggered lattice. It has some topological phase that has edge modes in it. So if I described it like this, you are not gonna be surprised when I tell you, now after all of this prelude, that if I wanna model this lattice with the LC circuits and just want to pretend that the photons are the ones that are changing the circuits, it's going to work. And in fact, if you do a simulation of this LC circuit with the staggered VNW, you are going to get your symmetric and antisymmetric edge mode. So, okay, that's nothing new, right? Because you can do a single particle physics in many different platforms. So there is nothing much fundamentally different between us proposing that we find the SSH, this topological SSH eigenstates in a superconducting resonator, or that we find them in the pendula, let's say. So the fun, interesting question that we were looking into with my student Jin was to actually create entanglement between those topological modes. Because now, you see, I start from a non-interacting model. So even if I do it in a quantum system, there is not much new to it beyond the experimental impressiveness that is implemented in a quantum system. So the next question is, what can I do to make it fundamentally quantum, right? And the first number one answer when someone asks you this is entanglement. So what we did is that we say we will take two of these and we will just couple them to a qubit. So in a sort of more like a quantum circuit scheme, it would look like this, but this is not super important to understand, especially if you are not from quantum info background. But really, then we do like relatively like simple and straightforward entangling protocol. Even if I'm entangling topological modes, in the end, I just want to create a tripartite entanglement state. So I'm gonna couple a qubit to the edge here and to the edge here. Then I am going to measure the qubit. And as you know from your quantum mechanics, if you have a specific multipartite state and you measure some, you can project into the state that is entangled. So when you measure qubit, you get a spin up or down. And then the remaining state of your system will be in a maximally entangled state of the two topological modes. So then we wanted to see, okay, so this is some proposal that our experimental colleagues find feasible on how to entangle these topological modes. So can we actually find some quantity to measure whether it's better to entangle topological modes or it just doesn't matter and we should just entangle whichever modes are in the resonator and do the quantum computing with those? So for that reason, we chose this negativity measure. Again, if you are not coming from a quantum information, the precise definition of this doesn't matter. It's just a good number that tells you the amount of entanglement in your system. If it's 1/2, it's maximum. If it's less, it's less. So this is our system where we plot the maximum entanglement measure as an amount of parameter fluctuation. And the blue one is the topological one. And you see that even if I fluctuate my parameters by 20%, I am staying put on 1/2 entanglement line. While in this bottom orange one, the moment I add a little bit of disorder, it just goes all over the Hilbert space, which basically tells you that you always collapse into some pretty much random state. So we can look at this figure in a bigger picture. So this top panel is showing me the entangled state of these edge modes, and this is the each point now is averaged over 100 Hamiltonians. This shows you how robust to the disorder it is. And this bottom panel shows you what happens when you entangle just like random modes in those two SSH chains that just look like this, because the moment you add a little bit of disorder, it all just goes whoosh. So this is sort of really like a basic motivation behind like doing this kind of engineered topological things, but on chip. So the ingredients here are that you have a simple topological model that you can engineer. Again, this kind of just making this resonator arrays, our collaborators just make it in like that's like a one clean room session. I am skipping over here over like experimental subtleties of implementing it, because of course coupling it to the qubit and coupling it correctly is tricky, but you can do it, and if you do it, suddenly you have entangled states that are pretty stable to the disorder, and then you can use them for something. So we are now thinking about lots of exciting things, how to actually do gates and algorithms with the states like that sort of naturally emerge in your protected superconducting states. Then I think I'm at the end of my pitch here. I have here break 10 minutes, but let's again at least take 3 or 5 just to stretch, and then we do the machine learning part. And if in the meantime you have questions, just ask me. So now I told you a bit about that, whatever, SSH states. And even though it's like the simplest topological model ever, you can still use them in a fun way for a research stuff. And now, in my lab, we are using a lot of machine learning for different things, but in this topological context, there is a lot of parameters to estimate and optimize and stuff like that. I couldn't really boil it down into a simple example, so I'm gonna give you a simpler one for the machine learning part. But for now, let's just really get some super basic machine learning primer. First thing I should say, there is lots of types of machine learning. And also now when machine learning became a popular term, you might hear people use the term for just doing clustering or stochastic optimization or Bayesian estimation or any kind of these statistical methods that you may already know. But the one new thing that emerged, well, it's not new, of course, in the math literature it was old, but only recently we have the computational power to really take advantage of them, are the neural network. So the naming and the way you probably heard and think about them is this brain analogy. I have neurons, they are connected to each other, like you would teach a puppy, you show it stuff multiple times and eventually it learns to reproduce that stuff. I find this neural thinking maybe a little bit unhelpful because it sounds a bit like intimidating, and in reality, it's really just a linear algebra with a nonlinear function on top. It's just that this kind of models, and actually nobody really understands why, but basically when the network gets deep enough, it beats some standard trade-offs that we have known about in a statistical learning, and it can perform really, really well compared to other methods on this learning from data tasks. And that's what all this hype comes from, and that's why your iPhone can autocomplete your sentences when you are texting pretty good. But okay, for now, let's just take this super simple example where we just have now you don't know yet what the neuron is, you just have, so now we have neurons, they are just the colorful blobs in the layers, and they are connected to each other to the output. So let's first explain what the neuron is. I saw some people raising hands that they had a machine learning experience, so someone can do my job for me and explain everyone what a neuron is and what it does. Almost perfect, yeah, as Charlie says. It depends how you define it, but indeed the cell body is a linear function, and then you apply some nonlinear activation function, really. So these would be the connections that goes from the previous layers. Those are the weights, and you are just calculate linear superposition, you add a bias to it, and then you apply some nonlinear function on top of it. So the weights, those are the trainable parameters. They are just connecting these neurons and the biases. So you can represent this. This is just a matrix. And then you need to put this nonlinear function on top. Why do I need a nonlinear function, actually? Yeah, exactly, right? Like there is some physics that is fully linear, but probably it's not a great idea if you get unknown data to try to fit it with the linear function, right? That's what all these jokes on Twitter are about nowadays. Okay, so maybe just at a very, very specific timeline. So this is just a screenshot that I took from Faifai Stanford course. There is a lot of discussion going on that like, should we trust this? We don't really know what it does. It's like neuron. Is it some artificial brain that does stuff? So just for your like own feeling, this is just like examples of the like a really graphical plotting of how the weights look. So the left example is a badly trained network where you just see some noise. But the correctly trained network, this was probably a convolutional network, is picking up some stuff. And when you plot the weights, you actually see some structure, bunch of places. This is just like to say that like, while the interpretation is hard, this is like a baseline thing you can do to just see if your network is outputting a nonsense or if it actually learned something. Yes, yes?
I have some kind of entropy function for a neural network to say if it's a good quality trained or not? Or?
Perfect question. So this is my next sentence here.
Oh, okay.
When you are training the weights, you need to optimize something, and what you optimize is called a loss function. And entropy is one example of what one can use as a loss function.
Okay, but my question was, like, I know there's an objective function, you want to optimize something, but because you said there's some kind of structure in the weights.
Oh, that you would wanna.
Yeah, that is not something that you optimize, but something that you can use a criterion of.
Yeah. So this is a great question. I am not an expert on this. There is a lot of really mathematical statistical research going into this, and there are some ways to quantify it. Lenka Zdeborova at EPFL is a great reference if you want to know more. But right now, for these huge networks where you are plotting a lot of structure, it's not easy to quantify, but I think people have some simple examples. If you have just like a handful of neurons, there is a statistical way to map it on the Ising model and then calculate something. So Zdeborova papers would be a good reference for that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, right. So back to the loss function. So indeed, you need to train this thing. So what you do is that you do all these layers, you propagate something, and then you need to evaluate if it's good. And then you have a function that is a function of your data that you want to minimize. And how you minimize it is that you adjust each of the weights in your network. It's hot today. With a derivative of your loss function. There is this number epsilon here. This is called the learning rate. This is a very simple conceptual thing. Imagine that you have so here I plot three-dimensional because I cannot plot anymore, but imagine that you have a multi-dimensional optimizational landscape because you have many parameters. And then what really the loss function is doing is that it identifies for you whether you are in the minimum of this loss landscape. But then this is very hard, right? And this learning rate tells you how big steps you are taking within the landscape. And then you understand why this is an important quantity, right? Because imagine I would have a fine structure like this, and the actual minimum would be here. If the step that I am walking through my optimizational landscape is this, then hardly I am gonna find something useful, right? And I'm just gonna pick a random one. And if it's too small, then I'm just gonna get stuck in one of these small minima and not learn anything. So it's just like a hyperparameter to do these updates efficiently. So now, of course, the hard question is how to calculate this derivative, right? Because the weights are all over the network. The loss function is something at the end. So how do we evaluate this? And this is really a question that is in the core of training neural networks. So the first things first, as I said, the weights are all over the network. We need to calculate some loss function. So let's remind ourselves what's a chain rule. Anyone? That's not a trick question. Just tell me what's a chain rule.
It's a chain rule. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So if you want to calculate the derivative of the function that is composite of multiple functions, how do you do that? And don't say using the chain. So does anyone actually remember the chain rule, or do I like?
dy dt equals dy dx dx dt.
Yes, and now you are letting very famous professor do this for you, so I don't know, right? Okay, but yeah, exactly like that, right? So you first calculate the derivative with respect to the outer function, and then you multiply it with the derivative of the inner one with respect to the variable, and so on. Okay, and this is really what you need to do when you are training a neural network, that you start at the end and then you propagate the errors backwards. So now we have here 3-layer neural network, and in each layer, we will like describe the action of the neural network by this function f. So in the first layer we have f1, in the second layer we have f2, and we will just be satisfied with 2 layers. So I need to calculate my derivative of the loss that is here on the output with respect to all the weights. So how do I do it? I calculate dl df to evaluate at the end. Then with my best estimate of df2, df1, I evaluate at this, and then the last one, and so on, and so on, and so forth. So really just do like this back propagation. It's really just applying a chain rule. It's just a very complicated chain rule because you have a lot of weights and often a lot of layers that you need to calculate. Okay, so now of course you feel like you understand back propagation perfectly, right? Okay, so let me just repeat the steps one more time. So first you calculate the forward propagation of the network, and then you calculate the backward phase. So you start from the final layer, you calculate the derivative of the loss function with respect to the output, you evaluate. You propagate that error into the previous layer. That means calculating the derivative in the previous layer and evaluate it in what you got in the last one. Then you do like this. Then you combine all the partial gradients into the final gradients by multiplying them. And then you update the weights in the direction that the loss is minimized, and so on and so forth. The good thing for you, yeah?
This is a basic question.
Please.
How do you decide what the loss function is?
Oh yeah, that's a great question, and that's a hard one. That really depends on the problem. So I'm gonna show in a second. In a lot of classification problems, the best thing to do is to have some kind of binary loss function, like a cross entropy, for example, because those binary or discrete options are easier to train because you sort of go into the local minima faster. If you want to predict a continuous parameter, people just use L2 loss, L2 loss, N1 loss, and they regularize it somehow. But the specific terms that you are adding to the loss function, they are really then dependent on the properties of your particular problem and the landscape, so it's not a, yeah. Yeah, but I will give this categorical cross-entropy example in a second. Yeah, so yeah, about this backpropagation, the good thing for you is that you actually don't need to understand it, because you will see that in practice you are just going to write torch.optimize and it's done. If you start doing some more sophisticated research, is useful to understand it in case you need to update one of these standard backpropagation algorithms. So that's why I'm spending 10 minutes now to explaining how it works. So you have some basic basic starter point. Okay, so let's do this then. We have now all the ingredients. We have the neurons, we have the loss functions, we have the backpropagation, so we can just do a simple classification problem. So here I picked that I want to classify if a character is from a Star Trek or a Star Wars universe. And we will build a neural network that will have two outputs that will tell us probability Star Trek, probability Star Wars. So there are two things. Yes, so I already talked about activation functions before. I want to specifically highlight one extra one, which is a softmax function that maps your output on the probability. If you are doing this classification problems, it's really useful to multiply, to normalize everything and have your outputs between 0 and 1. Because like if you get 1,000 for a Star Trek character, what does it mean? That's just a normalization. Again, you will not have to worry about it in your actual code because this Python packages optimizer just do this for you. And then we pick a loss function, here categorical cross entropy, that calculates the difference between predicted and correct output during training. Now I don't remember which is P and which is Q, but we will find out on the next slide. Sorry? P is the prediction. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. So, right. So we pick a mini example. Here we will have Leia and Spock. So now the prediction, the label, will be 1, 0 for Leia, 0, 1 for Spock. And then the output will be two probabilities, probability Leia, probability Spock, that will add to 1. So for Leia, the loss will be -1 times logarithm, whatever the first input of this vector is, -0, whatever the output, and vice versa for Spock. Then you can quickly look at this setup and believe me that you get a smallest number in each case when the label is exactly correct, because you get a 0, and otherwise you get a positive number. And if you are completely opposite wrong, you actually get a very big positive number. So that's yeah. So okay, so this is really like a basic setup, and now we can move on to doing this on a sophisticated quantum problem. So before we get to it, let me really describe exactly what's in the notebook and what we are going to do. So we are gonna take not this like sophisticated entanglet one I was showing at the beginning. We are just gonna take this SSH chains of the superconducting resonator, or actually whatever you wish it to be. We will generate the systems of eigenfunctions, and we are going to train a neural network to learn to decide whether the state is topological or trivial. Just a notational side comment here, so I don't have to carry with me all of these indices and you don't have to look at complicated plot. I'm going to just for the visual impact do this, that I'm just gonna plot the wave function amplitude distribution visually like this. We all understand that it's a wave function over the lattice. I'm just gonna make a drawing instead of doing the axis. Okay, so we go back to this like classification example that we now understand very well. So, okay, now nothing stops me, because for the neural network, this is just the pixels, right? So what stops me to organize the pixels of my eigenvectors of the wave function amplitudes and show it instead of the layer picture, right? So we can classify that just as well. Like we accidentally picked such a example where it's very easy to map the quantum machine learning problem on an existing classical machine learning problem. So this would be an example of just like a sector of the spectrum of the topological model. You see here in the gray square that you have those localized eigenvector, and this would be example of the trivial. I am not showing all the eigenmodes here. So really, our task, what we just need to do is to generate this data set. yeah, feed it into the neural network and let it decide, is it topological or a trivial phase? So actually now, before we do it, let's just understand whether there is actually anything hard about this. So if I just ask which one of those is a topological one. Yeah, exactly. Super simple, right? So in your notebook, you are gonna do this by creating a neural network that takes in, we will have 16 sites. So we will have 16 eigenstates of the Hamiltonian that takes it 256 numbers. Then you will have hidden layers. Here I randomly picked 32 and 60 neurons and 2 output features, and then you just train it. This is a plot that I got with your exercise notebook. This is the output probability on the output layer as a function of the ratio of the VW coefficients. And you see that you are, so the blue one will be a topological one. You see that you had a probability 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. Then you are getting close to the phase transition, so suddenly it drops. And then if you simulate it for a bunch of different sizes, you are gonna get the intersection point where the phase transition happens, just looking at the output probabilities of the neural network. This is coincidentally a nice correspondence to a very famous Karaskia-Melko paper from 2017, where they did this for icing model configuration, and this was the most, one of the flagship papers of this field, where they learned the phases of the different icing models just with a neural network, and just as they did, you can just with the few lines of code doing something like that. But now, okay, this was super dumb, right? Because I ask you which is topological, which is trivial, you tell me immediately, because I just spent hour explaining to you what's the difference, right? So if you know this, it's of course very simple. So presumably the thing that you looked at when I asked you to classify those two things was just this, right? Is it there something at the edge or isn't? And if it is the topological one, and vice versa, right? So let's do another one. How about these two?
Is this with periodic boundary conditions?
No, I just erased the edges.
I'm going to go left. Although no, because last time it was left, so now it's the right.
Yeah, it's right, and you could look. It was a 50% probability. Let's not get too excited. Okay, so here you still could have guessed, because even if I take the edges away, it's kind of zero here, and right, all the wave function probability had to go somewhere, right? Okay, but the final one. Now I blacked out what's sitting in the middle of the spectrum. So now what? Which one is which? Do we have ideas? Okay. The left one is topological, but that was just guessing, right? So there is a 2 levels of difficulty, that either you can remove the edge, or you can remove the middle of the spectrum. So what's really important to remember is that these edge modes, as probably you heard in your other lectures, they are just manifestation of something that's happening in the bulk, right? So now in the notebook 2, I have a fun advanced exercise, and those of you who are just starting, you don't have to worry about this. You can leave it for later, where we will do exactly that. We will use the same model, but we will give it data without edge sites and data without edge modes, and then you will have a surprise waiting for you whether it's still classifiable or not with a neural network. And that's a very interesting thing, right? Because in practice, we are using observations of those edge modes to determine things, and looking at the bulk alone, that's tricky, right? So maybe this is an interesting thing to think about.
Is it something that you could do just by closing and making it periodic? Because then you'd kind of, again, remove the part where you see it.
Oh, sure, that's totally right. Like,
You will
yeah,
have the same kind of situation.
you will have the same effect. Yeah. I gotta say that I didn't think about these periodic systems, but indeed, I think it would have the same features. Yeah,
You kind of have to find the bulk
yeah,
reasoning that you have with topological and high school.
yeah.
But I mean, isn't that, I mean, usually we look at the bug to classify the topology, right? So, I mean, is this for a case when I accidentally delete half of my wave function that I calculated, or is it, or, I mean, can you apply to the case where I don't know the bug boundary corresponds, or I don't know the invariant?
Yeah, okay, so how do I answer this without like giving us spoilers for the... I think maybe I just want you to, maybe I just want you to like spend 10 minutes thinking about what it is that the neural network has learned and whether it makes sense in the context of your understanding of topology. But let's discuss after we actually looked at the code.
How do we know that 2 output states is the right number? Because for SSH, we know there's one topological and one trivial state. But generically, if we got some experimental data from Charlie or someone, we may not know what we're looking for.
This is true, right? I am not like, let's be very clear, I'm not standing here and being like, I have solved topology. These guys, they are like done now because you can do everything with this neural net, right? Like I am, that's obviously not what's happening, right? So this is a very specific examples where we have a labeled data. So we even did something super dumb that we knew the phases up front, we labeled them, and then we are just saying, I remove some of my wave function and can I still classify, right? So today we are only doing this supervised thing. We are not even learning anything new. At the end of your notebooks, I put links to even more advanced notebooks that I made that we don't have space in this school for. There are unsupervised methods where you don't have labels and you give it experimental data and you learn something new. We had some limited success with this as a field. There are unsupervised methods that found some new features in some of this Fermi-Hubbard or Bose-Hubbard type of models that people didn't think about, but maybe suspected that they are there. So that's definitely a thing you can do. But exactly, like if I don't know anything and I don't have any labeled data, then in this setup, this is not going to help me, and then one has to think very hard about how to make an algorithm that is useful for something.
Just as a simple example, have you ever tried doing unsupervised learning with this type of model where you know everything, you just want to kind of see if you can kind of guess things?
Oh, totally. So yeah, I don't have the slides for this. That is a super fun. If you just take configurations of the Ising model, 2D, so you have a nice phase transition there, you ran it through just the principal component analysis. Beautiful clusters. You get one cluster for all down, one cluster for all up, middle for the mixed one. And from color of your plot, if you colored your Monte Carlo samples by temperature, you can even guess like the transition temperature to like a first decimal number. So this is very well tested, and we developed, like myself included, a lot of models that like you can do unsupervised on a weird things that don't have a phase transition but only have some kind of finite size crossover. You can do unsupervised learning for topological states, but we have this big but that we don't have a big discovery of, like we verified as a field all the things it can work for, and we have some smoking guns for things, but we are sort of now we are at the stage that we need to see how to make this really useful for the raw data where I know nothing.
When you train a system on one state and then apply it to state in the same symmetry class, but state on some Hamiltonian and then apply it to other Hamiltonian on the same symmetry class?
Yes, so that's a great question. So one of the things that is not super well understood about neural networks is this generalization power. I would say sometimes, like for this is really important to prepare labeled data that you know and just try. Like oftentimes what worked for us experimentally is that we have some model that does not take into account this, this, and this, but it's still something that we can simulate. And we train that model only on the simulated data, because then I don't have to force the experimental team to sit there for forever and label the data. And it still works decently well. So we see evidence of this transfer learning, specifically if you are like a reasonably close. So I imagine that if you actually, I wouldn't say if you train on a one specific Hamiltonian, because then you sort of overfit on the Hamiltonian. But I would imagine that if you would take a bunch of Hamiltonian within the same symmetric class and do this classification, I wouldn't be super surprised if it would work on another one. Let me say like this. Okay, before we go to the notebooks, I want to say a few more practical things that I would feel bad about if I wouldn't teach them to you today. But the classification tasks we have to do, they are not super hard, so you will not super need them, but I want to sleep well and remember that I taught you about convolutions. So you will have in your notebook this simple two-layer network that I was showing in all the images. And then if you just use that, you will get some accuracy. And then goal of your exercise will be to get a bigger one. So basically, you have many options how to fine-tune your network when you are being in practice machine learning researcher. So let me just name a few of those so you know what your tools are. So we were just talking so far about layers where everything was connected to everything. This is not super practical thing, because if you have a really big input, you suddenly need to store super much weights. So the solution for this is the so-called convolutional network, where you have a filter or a kernel that is just scanning your layer on a finite size. This would just mean that the 3x3 block of you only have a 3x3 block of your input connected to the next layer. And then the kernel is sliding. Here I did a stride 2. It's called stride, by how much you move. And then you are doing like this direct product that you multiply this and this, then you sum it together and you get a dark dot here, because I have a dark here and here, so I have a lot of dark. Here is going to be lighter, and so on. So
Overlap is important, that when you slide, that you still kind of overlap with the previous one.
sorry, say again the question?
The overlap, when you slide down, you still kind of include some of the previous ones.
Yeah.
Important? Is that kind of the reason that otherwise you disconnect the nodes too much, or is this just kind of something that has proven to be better?
It actually depends on the data. I saw some of these really big image classifiers that they just have super coarse kernels that are not even overlapping. Or maybe the kernel is really huge and you overlap on one side. And then as you go deeper into the network, you decrease the stride and you... Basically, it's for resolving the fine features, because exactly as you say, right? Like if you would have features sitting at the boundary and I would just do this and this, I would never... The symmetry I built into my network would just completely ignore it. So that's not a good strategy, but I see people doing huge kernels, huge strides, and then you go deeper and you compress everything. Okay, so that's first one. That's a convolutions. This was the key game changer for all the image recognition kind of thing, because there is also this thing that this kernel, that's the same for the whole layer. You just keep sliding it around. So if you want to train an image train a network that finds a cat, and sometimes the cat is here, and sometimes the cat is here, you want to have a filter that sort of searches for it. If you would have everything connected and you only trained on the images where cat is in the middle, then the deep neural network wouldn't be so good classifying images with cat is in the corner. This is what people mean when they say that these networks are translationally symmetric.
So here you're training the kernel, the shape of the kernel, the parameters. What are the parameters in this case?
Yeah, indeed. So the weights would be now connected directly to the kernel. So that's what you're training. Okay, next kind of layer is the so-called dropout. This one is very simple. You just decide randomly which neuron to kill, and you kill all the connections going to it. This is
this convolutional architecture good for classifying phases? For example, if we have long-range order or long-range entanglement phases, then we would not want to break this system down into parts, right? And also, like, if the wave function has some symmetry, this is not respected in this network, and the symmetry would actually help in the dimensionality of searching for phases. And
Yeah.
I don't know, it seems like there should be something else to be used.
That's a great question. Actually, it's a sort of. Am I erasing something important? You remember this thing, right? Yeah, so there is actually like a really funny example. When you have a Ising gauge theory, where the lattice is like this, and they are on the connections, and then the zero energy state is the one where all the plaquette products are even, and once you start raising temperature, you would flip some of these, and it would cross over into the high temperature phase. You can put arbitrarily large, fully connected network on this, and it will never learn it, because it will try to learn all the different combinations, which is n factorial or whatever, in this thing, and then try to transfer it on a new configuration. And then you will try to just remember all the possible combinations, and it doesn't work unless you have like 1 million neurons. Show it to like a well-connected convolutional layer, even without telling it what the constraint is, and it will pick it up immediately. I am saying this example not to contradict what you're saying. I am saying it because there are like different types of topological order that like manifest differently. And in some of these like standard examples that we are using, like this different like Kitaev phases, like a toric code, I didn't find the convolutions to be hurtful, but I am sure that you could find some weird thing where the thing that determines your thing is this, right? And then of course the convolutional kernel will never pick it up. So in this sense, I agree with you, but also there are constraints that are complex, but more in the actual, after you do the measurement and project on something, they are actually more spatially contained. And in that case, this is awesome. So it's a bit, yeah. Okay, super. Yeah, I was at this dropout layer. Again, you don't have to worry about this super much. You just write torch.dropout and it's done. This is for the so-called, it's one of the so-called regularization techniques. So imagine that you train your algorithm on only black cats, but then you wanted to find a white cat also. You wanted to learn what's a cat, but you don't want it to think that a cat is always a black cat. So if you just keep randomly killing the neurons and retraining it and showing it more and more data, you prevent that it will overfit on something. Then you can vary the learning rate. This is really important. I was also talking about this before. And then you can vary the so-called batch size. Usually what you do in practice, it's not a good idea to show it one, let's say, spin configuration or one eigenspectrum and go into all of this cost of doing the backpropagation and then show a different one and again. That's super costly and it's not very efficient. The best way to generalize is to group the data into a bunch. This is called a batch. You give it to your neural network all at once, and then it will do the backpropagation per batch. So it gets to generalize quickly from data. And again, how big batch sizes you pick, this depends on the problem. There is also a different opinions on what are the best practices. Sometimes you need to change it during training, and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to highlight these 3 things you can do. You add more layers. You can also change the number of neurons within the layer. You vary the learning rate. You vary the batch size. And that's it. OK, now we can finally go look at the code. You will find your notebooks if you go to the website of the school. There is a hands-on thing. What I want you to do is to make like groups of 3. I think that not everyone bring a laptop, and I think it would be also great if people who already have some experience sit with the people who maybe don't. Okay, let's get started. I know it's rough. It's like when you go skiing on a third day, there is always the most injuries. So this is like a quantum version of that, but we can do it. Looking at the time, I wanted to go over the code in a greater detail, but maybe I will just go quickly and to give you also some time to experiment. So first thing I want to say, there is a lot of different machine learning packages, and they offer like a different layers of freedom and generalization. And so what I normally do when I teach at the school, I take the simplest one that is called Keras, that is really like you just write very simply, you train it, everything is automatic. But then I found that it's not super easy for students to reuse the code then, because it works well on this well-prepared data sets, but if you want to then do something of your own, it's hard. So I want to try this time to do it in PyTorch, which will show you a little bit more code. So, but don't be intimidated. Then I hope that it's a thing that you can actually reuse this code later on your own mini example, hopefully pertaining your own research. So on the links you found 2 notebooks. We just do the first one, and then the second one that's with this limited data. It's for those of you, maybe if you are bored by this simple supervised learning example, you can just move on to the notebook 2. But let's only look at the notebook 1 for now. So hopefully when you open your link, you will see something like this. Yes? So let's quickly go over this together, and then I let you do your groups and experiment. So this is just like an example how like this minimal classification machine learning code actually looks like. So in this first cell, we are just going to load the libraries that we need. So NumPy, SciPy, plotting, and then we load the PyTorch like this. Then there is just a small cell that you don't have to pay attention to. This is just to check whether you have a GPU and use it correctly. Now, the whole data generation thing, you will find out that in practice, this is way more difficult than doing the actual machine learning thing normally. So we did this one for you here. You can just use it, and you can revisit the code later if you want. So in this part, you just define a function that gives you sorted eigenvalues and eigenvectors of the SSH Hamiltonian as a function of V, W, and number of unit cells. Here we pick n unit cells, we pick a range of the V and W, and we just create the spectrum, and then I'm just printing here that this is like a 10,000 examples of your topological spectrum. Then when you have this, you can pick the just example of your Hamiltonian. So I pick here Hamiltonian number 1000, and then I'm just gonna plot all the eigenfunctions. So you see, you have this kind of profiles that I was showing you in the lecture also. We are scrolling full of suspense, and here we find the topological one. So the Hamiltonian number 1000 is the one that has the H mode. So this will be your data. And now you need to create, so the part 2 now is the part where you actually need to create a data set. So in this first part, we are just gonna really like flatten the data and assign it together with the labels. So we just really have a NumPy file with all the data that we can load. Oh, and here is super important line, because now we will need to turn it into training and testing data. So what you need to do before you save your NumPy with all of your flattened vectors of eigenspectrum is to shuffle it. So you don't take first 80% that is trivial and some topological, and then you don't have 20% of your test set that is only topological, and vice versa. So now here we create the test and training set. This is just this line will reserve 20% of your data for the validation set. And really now here is just the train full SSH is the training set, and train Y full SSH are the labels. And the same for the test set, that you just go from the beginning to the validation size and from the validation size to the end. Okay, and then I know I am going through this quickly, but this you can just do shift enter, like to do these, and if you want to look at later, you can just talk to me or talk to me in Slack. The last thing we need to do, this is again just written in a way that you can just straightforwardly reuse it, is something called custom dataset. Basically, Torch has a class that is called dataset. And the dataset is what are these, maybe you have heard about these famous datasets, that there is a dataset with all the handwritten digits that you can then load into the machine learning model and classifies. Those are already prepared for you in this dataset forms. Everything has a correct shape, the labels are assigned, everything is randomized, and vice versa. So what we need to do is to write our own dataset function that will return the shape of the data and the labels, the length, and really that's really it. So then we will have train dataset class and test dataset class. And then how PyTorch works, that if you have these things, you can just hand over the dataset to the so-called data loader, which then just takes your data and it will keep updating them correctly during training. So up until now, you didn't need to understand anything I said if you are new to coding. And if you are not, just, feel free to reuse the code. But now, the important thing is, right, because so let's say that up till now, I just gave you a lot of code that prepares the data set. And I left it in the notebook so you can actually reuse the notebook later. But this, in principle, you don't need to know. But now the important thing is to hand over the data set to something called data loader. And that's the thing in PyTorch that does all the grouping into batches and sampling and all of these things that you need to do during training. So really important line of code here is to have a train data loader, which is a data loader that takes as arguments what is the training part of your data set and what is your batch size, nothing more. I talked a lot about preparing the training data, so I prepared them for you, but then you need to write this line that you give data loader your training data set, and then you give your data loader your test data set. This for loop here is just to plot that everything has a correct shape, which it does because here I picked the batch size 25, and the 256 is this 16 times 16 input that we're talking about. Okay, all of this is basically just the introductory thing. The really important thing, and that's the code that you guys will be changing, is coming now, and that's how you build and train a machine learning model in Torch. So these lines, again, they are not important. They are just to check if you have a GPU, basically. And really what you do when you build a neural network is to use this neural network module in PyTorch that really is just a class that lets you build layers, just layer by layer. So I chose here this sequential object, which makes it easier that you keep just sandwiching the layers as you want them. So first we have a linear layer that takes 16 times 16, 256 vectors, and connects them to 32 neurons. This is the 32 here. So if you want to change the number of neurons in the middle layer, this is the number you will be changing. Then we have an activation function, which is the ReLU function. It was one of those that I had on my slide. It's the one that is until 0, it's like this, and then it's a linear function. But again, doesn't matter. You can go, at the bottom you have a link to the documentation. You can go and you can switch this to a different activation function if you want. Tangent hyperbolic might be a fun choice. So the next layer has 32 neurons and connects them to the 16. Now, the really important thing is that if you change this number, the 32 here, oh, yeah, sorry, I thought you don't see. Yeah, if you change the 32 here, you also need to change it here, right? Because the output of the previous layer is the input of the next layer and vice versa. So we do this. Should I make it even bigger? Maybe, right? Is this better? Yeah, okay. So this is really how we define the layers. Again, if you are new to classes, just copy this thing, whatever. And what you just need to do is to, change the numbers of neurons here. Maybe you can just add more layers, change the activation function, the stuff that we talked about during the lecture, yeah?
I didn't get why do you have to add this activation after each layer?
Oh, it's just the way it works in PyTorch because they have this, the linear thing is called linear because it just does a linear transformation. I know that in other machine learning packages is different, so maybe that's why it's confusing. But you really just do the linear combination and then you put the activation by hand. It's just a convention, it's nothing deep. Okay, and then the other thing you need to do is to define the forward sweep through the network. We are just doing something super simple here, so it almost doesn't matter, but you really just create a new variable, and you say that this linear ReLU stack, which is how I called my neural network here, I just say I apply that on the x, and then I return this logits variable. The reason why you do this, and maybe why some other machine learning packages don't do this, is that PyTorch is amazing because you can define, if you want to do something really weird for the forward sweep, you can just define it here. You can just only apply some layers, or you can only go through part of your network. And it's not written here because we don't need it. You could similarly define your own backward function that does very customized backward update of your network, but again, we don't need it. So again, if you're doing this for the first time, you just take this, you copy this thing. That's all you have to do, or even just rerun this cell. So the really key thing here are these layers, and that you can change the number of neurons here, or you can change the type of layers. You could, for example, you could do the activation here, and after that you could add a dropout we talked about to regularize the training a little bit. So then you can print your model, and what you will see is exactly what we were talking about. You take input, this is the output bias. True just mean we are also not just using weights, but also biases. Those were the B in the linear combination I talked about during the network. Okay, we are almost there, just these two last things. We need to define a loss function. Again, we have a Python package that does this, so cross-entropy loss is literally the loss I had written on my slide. It's just a function that compares binary between these two outputs and the correct label. This cross-entropy, actually, now, maybe I am doing this a little bit fast, so maybe you didn't notice, but maybe let's think. If you look at this network, is there anything weird about the final layer? Is it like missing something? Yeah. Sorry? Yes, so the linear layer is fully connected layer, but it's missing the activation function. And the reason it's missing the activation function is a fun reason, because this cross entropy loss, first thing it does is to do the activation function and mapping on the probability before it starts calculating anything. This is just, I am telling you, so you are not surprised. Okay, and then you need to pick an optimizer, which again I picked for you. Feel free to go to the documentation and pick a different one. This is just like a stochastic gradient descent is one of the standard methods to calculate these derivatives during the backpropagation. The super important thing here, LR, that's your learning rate. So that's if you want to optimize your model. This is the one number that perhaps you might like to change. Then I am gonna skip a little bit. This train and test functions, they are actually pretty much just taken from the standard PyTorch tutorial, because if you write your code well and you prepare this data set and everything and you have a data loader, then the arguments of the training functions are the same no matter what it is. It's just your data loader, your model, your loss function, and your optimizer. And this we just defined in all the previous cells. So there is nothing I need to do with this function. This is just what it does. And it just does the thing that we talked about, that it forward propagates, calculates the prediction error, does the back propagation, and evaluate once every few batches. And the same for the testing data. Again, this you can just pass over if you are new, because we wrote our code well. It just takes as an input the things we have already written, so we don't have to worry about it. Okay, and then the final most important cell is that you pick the number of epochs. So actually, do we know what's an epoch? I feel like I didn't say it during the talk. Can anyone explain what's an epoch? Yes, exactly. So you have a number of the training data, and you keep picking batches. So let's say you have 100 training data points, which in practice would be very little, and your batch is 10. So when you do 10 back propagations of batch size 10, you went over your training set of 100, and that's the one epoch. And usually what you want is to show the data few times. Yeah. So here I picked 10 epochs completely randomly, and then again we wrote our code well, so there is nothing special here. We just say for loop for t in range number of epochs, do the training, do the testing, when you are done, print done. And then what's going to happen is this. I start at the accuracy of 84%, and at the loss 0.6, and every time I do one more epoch, my accuracy is going to keep increasing. And at the end, I get something around 99%, pretty much with the random parameters on this very simple data set. So now your exercise comes in. Again, I will repeat, I wanted to write this notebook properly, so it's actually complete and reusable, which means that at the beginning there is a lot of code you don't understand because I just scrolled through it and I told you this does this, whatever, right? But you can just really reuse this notebook. You can run all the cells, and then your exercise is to go to town, find this model definition, and try to, change the layers, change the neurons, change the learning rate, change the batch size. Just try to pre-train it for yourself. And your goal is to average over 5 different training runs to get a better accuracy than me. That's it. So try to make your groups of 3, please, and just try to run the code and try to make the final accuracy better. And if you have questions, just call me. Please just walk in the groups, because I cannot probably help you, all of you, individually if you have a lot of errors. So let's just work together and try. maybe one thing, if you wanna have, so this one that I shared with you is only for reading. I think you can write into it and probably even run it, but it will not be saved. So if you want to have your own saved version, do this: save, copy in Drive, and yeah, rename it or whatever. Yeah, you can just use it.
Officially, this particular afternoon session is closed. This is fantastic. I can see that you guys enjoyed it very much. I know it want you to all too. Please feel free to stay and keep going on and on for as long as you like. But officially, we're done.
Or you can let me go to the beach also. Just also big thanks from me. I see that everyone was getting really good accuracy. Really great job. This was your, for many people, first machine learning thing. So now you have a first working code. Congrats, and feel free to replace your data set with the latest PhD related data and try it out. So thanks for listening.